Hello, everyone. This is Deborah Richardson, and today I am putting the AP in Happy, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. This podcast will give a voice to accounts payable team members by talking about the growing reality of cyber attacks in their world and which vendor setup and vendor management techniques they can apply to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Visit the Vendor Process Training Center to enroll in your choice of 55 plus training sessions that will help you and your team avoid fraud, compliance fines, and bad vendor data. Or just sign up to get access to vendor process FAQs and to attend weekly drop-in live Q&A sessions. Visit training.deborahrrichardson.com today. The link will be in the show notes. So, $2 million questions that I get all the time, and it seems like it should be so easy to answer. They definitely expect me to answer it quickly and easily, but it's really not easy to answer those questions. And what are they? Keep listening. Welcome to episode 227. $2 million easy questions I get all the time that are not easy to answer. So, January, and I think I've said this before on another podcast, and I think it was on podcast 221 that was published on January 19th of 2023. So, a couple months from this podcast recording. And that was titled, or that episode was titled 5 Steps to Redesign Your Vendor Process to Avoid Payment Fraud. And I did that in January because January's now are turning out to be the month that I get a lot of calls, because that's when accounts payable teams or vendor teams are finding out that they had fraudulent payments during the chaotic, busy month of December. And so they call me and they want to know, the first easy question is, what is everyone else doing to prevent fraud? And so I'm just kind of expected to regurgitate 2 to 3 easy things that they can put into place, and then they will avoid fraud like everyone else. Problem is that that's not something that is doable, because it really depends on your company, your industry, the type of vendors that you have, where the vendor process sits, and some other factors as well, which is why, again, I published episode 221, because my point with that is you really need to look at your entire vendor process to see where the gaps are and then plug those gaps up. That's what everyone else should be doing. That's not what everyone is doing. But what everyone else is doing, it doesn't necessarily mean that you should do that too, or that everyone else should do the same thing that everyone else is doing, because everyone is different. And everyone may not be doing what they should be doing. They may have just gotten lucky up to this point that they haven't been caught. And so the folks or the teams that actually contact me, what I want to say is they're probably doing what you were doing, and will stop doing it when they get caught, just like you just did. That would not go over very well, but it's the absolute truth. If the phone call is what everyone is doing, people are getting caught by that phone call too, especially when it's delegated down to multiple team members, because maybe you have a bigger department and not everyone is following the process. If you have a process in place, just having a process to say, make that confirmation call, or having a step to say, make that confirmation call is really not good enough. You need a script, you need some documentation. You need to make sure that you know which ones are pending, because the vendor is not going to pick up right each time. So there are things around that you need to make sure it's successful. So if they say they have a confirmation call in place, that doesn't mean that it's automatically the best thing for you, because you also need to know about those folks that are doing it the right way and they have scripts and other controls around it. The other thing is that maybe they're doing a step or a restriction that you can't do. And a great example is there was one example of a colleague who, if they couldn't make that confirmation call, then they would just not change the banking and not pay the vendor. Now, maybe with their vendor types, their vendor mix, they can do that, but you can't necessarily do that with a strategic vendor where you have to get those inventory items in, or your product, right, won't be shipped. And so you have to find a way to get to make everyone happy, right, and get the banking change validated, and then also be able to update the vendor so that you can pay them. Also, you have to keep in mind too that you just can't not make a bank change. You have to identify, whether or not that vendor needs to be put on payment hold, because outside of them being a strategic vendor, you've got to think about the fact that you can't just do nothing, because that vendor's banking may have changed. And if you continue to send that same banking to in your pay file to the bank, that payment is going to either fail, or if the vendor has changed their banking but are using the same bank, their bank may go ahead and make the change to the new account number. They'll let you know via notice of change, but they're not going to do that forever. And at some point, if you don't make that change, then you're going to be looking at a notch file. So you just can't ignore it because no one will pick up the phone. You have to have additional processes around it, because they could be a strategic vendor, or the banking could have legitimately changed, and you have to make that change in your system. Else, you're going to be looking at failed payments or notch fines. And there can be other scenarios like that too. The point is that you can't look at what everyone else is doing, number one, and assume that because they're doing it, that's why they don't have fraud. And number two, whatever they're doing may not work for your company, your industry, your processes, and maybe not even your accounting system or ERP, depending on what is required in what they are doing. Which is why I say you need to make sure that you're looking at your entire process, from getting in that original inquiry about how do I create a vendor, how do I change a vendor, all the way through to making that change or add in your accounting system or ERP. And so that's something that I do for my clients in a 2-week project that I have designed, but you can do the same thing on your own. And I outlined what that process is in episode 221. So make sure you check that out. And especially check that out if you were thinking of calling and going, hey, Deborah, what is everyone else doing to avoid fraud? I'm going to point you right to that podcast episode. All right, so that was the first $1 million question. Now, what is the second $1 million question? Well, that question is, what validations should I be performing for my vendors? And this is another one that team members, vendor team members, accounts payable team members will reach out to their colleagues and ask which ones they should be doing. And there's nothing wrong with doing that. You might find some validations that people are doing that you are not doing, that you are supposed to be doing. But it's just like the vendor redesign process. You really need to make sure that you are basing your vendor validations on critical items that are unique to your company. So the first example is based on your company's industry. And I hope I'm saying that the right way. I always kind of get that confused. But for example, if your company or entity is a government entity, local, city, state, county government, then you've got some additional validations that you need to do to make sure you're not paying vendors that are on specific exclusion lists. So, for example, if you are a city, you actually have to check sam.gov and validate against their excluded parties list system. I think that's what it is. The acronym is EPLS. But you have to make sure you're not doing business or paying the federal funds that you're getting from the government, right? You have to make sure you're not paying that to vendors that have been excluded from receiving federal funds, and they're on this list. And so you need to add that. And I do have a lot of county government, city, right, local and state governments entities that I do business with the vendor process redesign, and I always have to add that. The next one is if you are a healthcare entity, if you're receiving Medicaid, Medicare funds, you have to make sure that you're checking to verify that those vendors have not been added to those exclusion lists where they cannot receive Medicaid or Medicare funds, right? And so you need to check the Office of Inspector General. They have LEIE, I believe that's what it is, the acronym, but it's a list of entities and individuals, right, that have been excluded from receiving those funds. But if you are not a healthcare entity, then you don't have to do that. If you are not a city, local, state government entity, then you do not have to check against sam.gov. So if you're asking those companies, your colleagues that are in those types of organizations, they're going to tell you that, and you're going to think you need to do it, and you don't. Or let's say you're using a service like TinCheck.com, and TinCheck.com, I talk about them all the time. I'm not affiliate. I wish I was, but they offer the combined validations, like all in one tool. So they will do the IRS 10 match. They will do the watch list. They'll do Social Security Death Master File. They'll do a couple other things as well. So you don't have to go to multiple places to do multiple searches. It's like an all-in-one tool that you can use. Well, they have a list of 42 different watch lists. And I get the question all the time, if one of the watch lists comes up and it's red instead of green, so green is good, red is bad, then they don't know if they have to care whether they get a hit on, let's say, the HHS, which is the acronym on TinCheck for the Office of Inspector General, right, for that LEIE list. They don't know if it matters to them. And if they're not a healthcare entity, then it doesn't matter to them. And so those are the types of things that you need to make sure that you are verifying that your company actually has to perform those validations. The other thing you need to look at is the country of the vendor, right? So if you are a U.S. entity, and most of my listeners are, and subscribers too, right? So if you're a U.S. entity, then you have to collect either a W-8 or a W-9 from your vendor. And in all cases, you don't always have to collect it, but best practice is to collect it because in some cases you do. So you have to collect that. And so you're used to hopefully doing the IRS 10 match. But what if the vendor does not have uh, a tax ID because they're a non-US vendor and they're in a country that has their own taxpayer identification number or business registration number or individual registration number? Not everyone has an IRS tax ID. There are certain circumstances where non-US vendors need to have one, like if they have a treaty claim, but if they don't, then they won't have one. Does that mean that you don't do a validation? That's not what that means. What that means is you identify what validations are available or applicable to that country, and then you see if there are resources available to do that validation. Now, I've done that homework for you. I've talked about it before. I have a file, an Excel file that has global vendor registration numbers in it for 100 plus countries. Some of those resources you can validate that the number is good. Other countries you just have to look at and verify the format is valid because they don't have anywhere to validate that. A great example is a VAT. So countries that require a VAT, that means that there will be VAT tax on the on your company's invoice or on the invoice that the vendor sends to your company, and your company's tax team most likely will file so that they can reclaim those VAT taxes paid. But in order to do that, they need a valid VAT number. And that I didn't explain what that is. Most of you probably know, but it is a value added tax. And so it's a sales tax and you can reclaim it, but you have to have that VAT number on file and it has to be valid. So when you are collecting and setting up that vendor, then you want to add a value added tax number if you're dealing with vendors in countries that have VAT. And you also want to validate that it is correct. Now, the next person that you ask or colleague that you ask, so you can mimic what they're doing, maybe they don't have vendors in those countries, and so they won't tell you anything about that, right? And so, again, you need to do your own research. Now, this global vendor registration numbers document that I have, it is a paid item, but if you go on my site, and actually I have a link to it in the show notes. I always have a link to the vendor validation reference list. That is a free list. It has 26 different resources for different pieces of data that you will find either on the IRS W-8 or W-9 or on the vendor's invoice or maybe on the authenticated email that you've received. But you can look at that and that'll give you some links to resources to do validations once you've identified what validations you need to do. So when you download that free document or when you get access to download the free document on that same page, you can use a coupon to get 25 discount code to get 25% off. And I think it's either $24.99 or $19.99, but you can get that for 25% off if you download the vendor validation reference list first. And that is, there is a link to that in the show notes. So that being said, right, it is some differences related to the tax IDs and different registration numbers that vendors can have based on country. And you can also, it can also be different, or you can do different validations based on the type of vendor, right? The industry that the vendor is in. So if they are a nonprofit vendor, then you need to do an additional validation that the IRS has that's separate from their 10 match. And I didn't mention it. Hopefully, if you guys are U.S. entities, again, most of my listeners and subscribers are, you are already doing the IRS 10 match when you collect the W-8 or W-9. But if that vendor is also a health or a nonprofit vendor, then you have to check the IRS's exempt organization select tool and verify that that vendor is valid or that that nonprofit or charity is valid. Now, you don't have to do it, but it is a great way to identify one, fake charities, right? Because fake charities pop up every time there is any type of disaster. And with the latest earthquakes in, was it Turkey and Syria, there are already fake charities popping up for that. And so you want to make sure that those charities are valid, that that they are real. And so you want to do that EO Select Check tool search to make sure the IRS has a record of them. And by the way, when you do that, if the IRS shows, they'll show their deductibility status, and it may show that your company, if you're paying them donations, right, that they may be able to use those and deduct those off their taxes. So if we had identified vendors that were 501c3 vendors, we would actually send all of the spend for those vendors for the year to our tax team. And I don't know if they ultimately use them on the company's tax returns or not, but we did use to track those. And so another reason why you need to make sure that creating a unique vendor validation requirements or list for your company, because you need to identify these types of criteria that would require different validations, because it's not going to be for every vendor. So just like the vendor process redesign, you need to make sure that you are customizing your vendor validations, because the validations that one colleague or another company uses may not be the same validations that your company uses. So you need to make sure that you customize that. Now you can start off with the vendor validation reference list that I give you at no cost. So that's a free download, and just start customizing from there. Right? Remove the ones that you don't use. Again, I have 26 different resources, but they're actually for 16 different validations. And so I've got multiple validations depending on what resources you want to actually use. So for example, if you are using the IRS e-services for validating or doing the IRS 10 match, then you can remove 10match.com because you don't need it. So that's the type of customization, in addition to removing the ones that you don't need, removing the validations that you don't need at all. So make sure you customize that list. And after you get done customizing it and someone asks you, well, what validations are you doing? You can tell them what you're doing, but you also need to tell them that they need to figure out if that is sufficient for their company, their industry, the types of vendors that they have, and have a similar response if they ask you what you are doing to avoid fraud. Now, if you want some help with either of those, again, I do have a vendor process redesign that takes 2 weeks, where I'll go through your whole process. I'll process map it. I'll create a new process, desktop procedures, and then train the whole team on it. Make sure you contact me. I will have my email address in the show notes. It's Deborah at DeborahRRichardson.com, and Deborah is spelled Debra. Or if you would like to have a vendor validation session where I will ask you questions about your company and your vendors, and I will customize that vendor validation reference list for you, and perhaps also identify some additional validation resources depending on how you answer the questionnaire that we go through. So if you would like that, it's actually on the vendor validation download page that you're going to navigate to get the free validations download. It'll be a link to schedule a vendor validation session. Actually, I'll just put that in the show notes too, and you guys can book a session with me. It is a paid session, but it only takes an hour, and the bookings are available as early as the next day. So it doesn't take long to know exactly what validations you need to do and then get a resource reference to do it with. All right, so with that, I want to thank everyone. I hope you enjoyed the 227th episode of Putting the AP in Happy podcast, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Don't forget to check the show notes for the links mentioned in the podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and writing a review of my podcast on the platform that you use to listen. Stay happy.